The air in the house was thick with tension, like a storm brewing just below the surface. 7-year-old Liam sat cross-legged on the cold tile floor, absently playing with his toy cars. His tiny fingers moved the red car back and forth, but his mind wasn't on the game. Instead, his ears strained to catch the angry voices coming from the other room. "Why do you keep blaming me, Henry?" His mother, Grace, shouted, her voice cracking with frustration. "You're the one who made the mistake. I'm the one trying to keep this family together." His father's voice was quieter, but just as menacing. "You think you're so perfect, Grace? Don't act like you're innocent. If you hadn't pushed me away, none of this would have happened." Liam's heart raced as he heard something crash against the wall. A picture frame, maybe? His parents had been arguing a lot lately, more than usual. Ever since Grace announced she was pregnant with their second child, things had spiraled out of control. His dad seemed angrier, his mom seemed sadder, and Liam felt like the invisible casualty caught in the crossfire. The fight dragged on into the night as Liam curled up in his bed, clutching his blanket. He covered his ears, but the muffled shouting seeped through the walls. He didn't understand everything they were saying, but one thing stuck with him: the words his dad had yelled just before slamming the door and storming out. "I didn't want this baby in the first place." Liam stared at the ceiling, confused and scared. Why didn't his dad want the baby? Would the baby make his dad leave for good? He loved his mom and dad, but lately their home didn't feel like it used to. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. His dad didn't come home, and his mom barely spoke as she prepared breakfast. Her eyes were swollen, her face pale. She forced a smile at Liam, but he could see the cracks beneath it. "Mom, is Dad mad at me?" Liam asked, his voice small. Grace froze mid-motion, the knife she was using to slice apples trembling in her hand. "No, baby," she said, forcing her voice to be steady. "Daddy loves you. He's just going through some things." But Liam wasn't convinced. The tension in the air was suffocating, and as the days passed, his dad's absence became longer. His mom's smiles became rarer, and Liam's little heart carried a burden he couldn't understand. One evening, Liam overheard his mom crying on the phone. She was talking to someone, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "He cheated on me. He doesn't want this baby, and now he's barely around. What am I supposed to tell Liam? That his father doesn't want his family anymore?" Liam's chest tightened. He didn't know what cheated meant, but he understood enough. His dad didn't want the baby, and maybe he didn't want them either. The next morning, Liam woke up determined. In his innocent, childlike mind, he thought he had figured out a way to fix everything. If the baby was the problem, then maybe everything would go back to the way it was if the baby was gone. His mom was in the kitchen again, humming softly as she prepared lunch. Liam watched her from the doorway, his little hands clenched into fists. He didn't want to hurt her. He loved her more than anything in the world. But he thought of his dad, of the shouting, of the tears in his mom's eyes. He thought about the way their home used to feel warm and safe, and how now it felt like everything was breaking. "Mom?" he said, his voice trembling. Grace turned to him, her face lighting up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What is it, sweetheart?" Liam hesitated, his small heart pounding in his chest. His gaze shifted to the counter, where a knife sat gleaming under the kitchen light. "Nothing," he whispered, turning and running back to his room. But the thought wouldn't leave him. It lingered. Growing stronger each day as the arguments continued, as his dad's absence grew longer, as his mom's sadness deepened. One night, after another fight that ended with his mom crying in her room, Liam crept into the kitchen. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting an eerie glow over the silent house. His tiny hands reached for the knife, his fingers trembling as he wrapped them around the handle. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered to himself. "I just want Dad to come back." He made his way to his mom's room, the knife heavy in his hands. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed open the door. Grace stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She smiled sleepily when she saw Liam. "What's wrong, baby?" she murmured. Liam's lip quivered as tears streamed down his cheeks. I'm sorry, Mommy, he sobbed. Grace's smile faded as she noticed the glint of metal in her son's trembling hands. Her breath hitched, and she sat up quickly, her instincts on high alert. Liam, she said gently, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. What are you doing with that? Tears streamed down Liam's cheeks as he held the knife tightly, his little hands shaking. I don't want to, Mommy, he sobbed, his voice breaking. But if the baby's gone, maybe Daddy will come back. Maybe we can be happy again. Grace's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She wanted to cry, to scream, but she knew she couldn't panic. Not now. Slowly, she reached out her hand. Liam, sweetheart, put the knife down, please. Let's talk, okay? You're not in trouble, I promise. Liam hesitated, his grip loosening just slightly. But Daddy said he doesn't want the baby. He doesn't want us. Maybe if... Stop, Grace interrupted, her voice firm yet tender. Liam, listen to me. This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. Do you hear me? Daddy loves you and I love you. Nothing will ever change that. Liam's lip quivered as he stared at her, torn between his overwhelming emotions and the love he felt for his mother. But he said, sometimes grown-ups say things they don't mean when they're upset, Grace said quickly, inching closer. Daddy doesn't hate the baby. He's just scared. Just like you're scared right now. But we can fix this, Liam. Together. You, me, and the baby. Okay? Liam's grip loosened further, but just as he seemed ready to hand over the knife, the sound of the front door slamming startled them both. Grace, where are you? Henry's voice echoed through the house, rough and impatient. Grace flinched, the moment slipping through her fingers. Liam's fear reignited at the sound of his father's voice, and he panicked. Without thinking, he lunged forward. It happened in a blur. Grace tried to grab the knife, but Liam's small hands were quicker. She felt the sharp sting in her abdomen, followed by an unbearable, spreading warmth. Her eyes widened as she collapsed to her knees, her hands instinctively clutching her stomach. Mommy! Liam screamed, dropping the knife. I'm sorry! I didn't mean to... The bedroom door flew open, and Henry stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale as he took in the scene. Grace on the floor, bleeding, and Liam sobbing uncontrollably beside her. What the hell did you do? Henry roared, rushing to Grace's side. It was an accident, Grace gasped, clutching Henry's arm as he tried to stop the bleeding. He didn't mean it. He's just a child. Henry turned to Liam, his face contorted with rage. You... Don't you dare! Grace cut him off, her voice weak but sharp. This is your fault, Henry. Your anger, your words. He's just a little boy, and you broke him. Henry froze, his eyes darting between Grace and Liam. For the first time, the weight of his actions hit him like a freight train. He had failed them. All of them. Call an ambulance, Grace whispered, her strength fading. Please. Henry fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed. Liam knelt beside his mother, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, Mommy, he sobbed. I just wanted Daddy to come back. Grace managed a weak smile, brushing a hand against his cheek. I know, baby. I know. It's going to be okay. But even as she said the words, her vision blurred, and the world around her began to fade. Grace's hand slipped from Liam's cheek as her breathing grew shallower. Henry knelt beside her, pressing his jacket against the wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. Stay with me, Grace. Don't you dare close your eyes, he pleaded, his voice breaking. Liam sat frozen, his small frame trembling as the weight of what he had done crushed him. His mother's blood stained his pajamas, the red stark against the soft blue fabric. He wanted to speak, to say he was sorry again, but the lump in his throat was too large to swallow. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the heavy silence. Henry ran to unlock the front door, shouting instructions to the paramedics as they rushed in with a stretcher. Grace was barely conscious as they lifted her, her lips moving faintly as though she was trying to say something. Liam clung to the doorway, watching helplessly as his mother was taken away. One of the paramedics paused to place a comforting hand on his shoulder, but he flinched, stepping back into the shadows. Henry grabbed Liam by the arm, his grip firm but not harsh. "Come on, we're going to the hospital," he said, his voice a mixture of anger, fear, and something Liam didn't quite understand: regret. The car ride was silent, except for Liam's occasional sniffles. Henry's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. Images of Grace on the floor, bleeding and gasping for air, played on a loop in his head. And then there was Liam's face, pale, terrified, broken. He couldn't shake the realization that Grace was right. He had caused this. At the hospital, Henry paced the waiting room while Liam sat quietly in a corner, hugging his knees to his chest. Nurses moved in and out, their expressions giving nothing away. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached them. Henry rushed forward. "How is she? Is she okay? And the baby?" His words tumbled out in a frantic blur. The doctor's face was grim. "Your wife is in critical condition. We've stabilized her for now, but she's lost a lot of blood. As for the baby..." He hesitated, glancing at Liam, who was watching with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I'm sorry. We couldn't save the baby." Henry staggered back as though he'd been punched. His vision blurred, and his legs felt weak. The doctor placed a hand on his shoulder, but Henry shook it off, sinking into a nearby chair. Liam didn't fully understand the weight of the words, but he could see the devastation on his father's face. Slowly, he slid off his chair and approached him. "Dad, I'm sorry," he whispered. Henry looked up, his eyes red and filled with pain. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he reached out and pulled Liam into a tight embrace. "It's not your fault," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not your fault, Liam." But as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure if he was saying them for Liam's sake or his own. The following days were a blur of hospital visits and quiet moments at home. Grace survived, but she was a shadow of herself. The loss of the baby weighed heavily on her, and though she tried to smile for Liam, her eyes always carried a deep sadness. Liam, meanwhile, became quieter. He stopped playing with his toys, stopped asking for bedtime stories. He spent most of his time in his room, staring out the window. One evening, Henry found him sitting on the floor, clutching the teddy bear Grace had given him when he was a baby. "Liam?" Henry said softly, sitting down beside him. Liam didn't look up. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted everything to be okay." "I know," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know, son. And I'm so sorry. For everything. For making you feel like you had to fix things. That wasn't your job. It was mine. And I failed you." Liam finally looked at his father, his eyes filled with tears. "Do you think Mommy will ever forgive me?" Henry's heart broke all over again. He pulled Liam into his arms, holding him tightly. "She already has, Liam. She loves you more than anything in the world. So do I." But even as he said the words, Henry knew that forgiveness wouldn't be enough to heal the wounds their family carried. The days turned into weeks, and the household remained fragile, like a glass teetering on the edge of a table. Grace returned home from the hospital, physically weaker, but determined to rebuild her life. Though her heart ached with the loss of the baby, she chose to focus on what remained: her son and the hope of a healed family. Liam was the first to meet her at the door when she came home, his eyes wide and filled with guilt. He hesitated to hug her, as though afraid he might hurt her again. But Grace knelt down, despite the pain in her body, and pulled him close. "I love you, Liam," she whispered. "Nothing will ever change that." Liam cried into her shoulder, his tiny hands clutching her tightly. "I'm so sorry, Mommy. I didn't want to hurt you. I just wanted us to be happy again." Grace pulled back and cupped his face in her hands, her eyes soft but resolute. "Happiness doesn't come from fixing everything, sweetheart. It comes from loving each other, even when things aren't perfect. Do you understand?" Liam nodded slowly, though tears still streamed down his cheeks. From that day on, the family began the slow process of healing. Grace started therapy, a step Henry encouraged after seeing her struggle with the weight of her loss. She was hesitant at first, unsure if talking about her pain would help. But as the weeks passed, she found solace in sharing her story with someone who listened without judgment. Her sessions helped her see that grief wasn't something to suppress but to embrace as part of the journey. She began journaling her feelings, often writing letters to the baby she had lost. It was painful, but it also brought her peace. For Henry, the guilt was suffocating. He knew his words and actions had created the chaos that nearly tore his family apart. He started attending counseling sessions on his own, determined to become the husband and father his family deserved. He made small but meaningful changes, helping more around the house, spending time with Liam, and apologizing to Grace every day. Not just with words, but with his actions. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, he took Grace's hand in his. "I failed you," he said quietly. "I failed Liam, but I promise you, I'm never going to be that man again." Grace looked at him, her eyes soft with forgiveness. "We all made mistakes, Henry. But what matters is that we're still here and we're trying. That's what love is." Liam's recovery was the hardest. He struggled with nightmares, often waking up in tears, calling for his mom. Grace and Henry worked together to reassure him that he was safe and loved. One night, after another bad dream, Liam climbed into bed with Grace and Henry. He curled up between them, holding his teddy bear tightly. "Will the baby forgive me?" he asked, his voice trembling. Grace kissed his forehead. "The baby is with God now, Liam. And God is love. That means the baby already forgives you." Liam nodded, his small body relaxing against hers. "I'll be better, Mommy. I promise." "You don't have to promise anything, sweetheart," Grace whispered. "Just be you. That's all we need." Months turned into a year, and the wounds that once felt unbearable began to heal. The family found strength in each other, leaning on love to guide them through the pain. One sunny afternoon, Grace called Liam and Henry into the living room. She was holding a small envelope, her smile radiant. "What's that?" Liam asked, curious. Grace handed him the envelope, and he opened it carefully. Inside was a black and white sonogram image. His eyes widened. "You're having another baby?" he whispered, looking up at her with a mix of excitement and fear. Grace knelt down and hugged him tightly. "Yes, we are. And this time we'll face everything together as a family. No more secrets, no more fear, just love." Henry placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. "You're going to be an amazing big brother, buddy. I know it." Liam looked between his parents, his heart swelling with hope. For the first time in a long time, the house felt warm again. As the months passed, Liam helped Grace prepare for the baby's arrival. He painted the nursery, folded tiny clothes, and even read stories to his mom's growing belly. The day his little sister was born, he held her tiny hand and whispered, "I'll protect you forever." And in that moment, the broken pieces of their family came together, stronger than before. Love, forgiveness, and hope had stitched them back together, creating a bond that nothing could break.